Pope Francis is the first pope since Leo XIII in the early 20th century to be buried outside the Papal Basilica of St. Peter in the Vatican. He has chosen to be buried in the Papal Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore, one of the most ancient and important churches in the city of Rome. He's been buried in this church for a very specific and rather beautiful reason, which we will come to in a moment. In the past, it has not been uncommon for popes to be buried elsewhere in Rome. In fact, only around 90 of the 266 popes in history have been buried in St. Peter's. And Pope Francis is the 8th pope to be buried in Santa Maria Maggiore. The first to be buried there was Pope Honorius III in 1227, and the last one was Clement IX in 1669. So it is not so much breaking a tradition as reviving an old one. Pope Francis has been buried in a niche in the north aisle of the nave of the basilica, a structure that primarily dates from the early 5th century. The space is one of a series of 4 niches that sit between the entrances to 2 very important chapels that are northerly additions to this ancient church. The 17th century Pauline or Borghese chapel, more on that in a moment, and the 16th century Sforza chapel. The particular niche that Pope Francis has been buried in was at one time a small chapel itself, designed for a side altar, but in the past 50 or 60 years it has been used as a store for candelabras. The next niche to it, to the east, which now has a confessional box in it, was at one time an entrance to the tiny chapel of St. Francis of Assisi, which adds an added poignancy to Pope Francis's choice of location. The 2 large chapels this burial place sits between are extraordinarily fine. The Sforza chapel to the west is the mausoleum of 2 brothers who both became cardinals, Guido and Alessandro Sforza, who were members of a prominent Milanese family, but were also grandsons of Pope Paul III. It was he who made them cardinals. You can't beat a bit of old-fashioned nepotism. The chapel they commissioned was designed in the 1560s by Michelangelo. The second chapel, the Pauline or Borghese chapel, was constructed by Camillo Borghese, who in 1605 became Pope Paul V and reigned as pontiff until 1621. The chapel was designed to be Paul V's mausoleum and was part of an elaborate reordering of this part of the church. The Pauline chapel was primarily built by Paul V to contain what is perhaps the most important icon or image belonging to the Roman people, an icon of the Virgin and Child that is known as the Salus Populi Romani, the protectress of the Roman people. The icon is kept directly above the altar of the chapel, and Pope Paul V's tomb in the west wall of the chapel has a kneeling effigy which shows him turned towards the icon in devotion. The icon itself is without question very ancient. By tradition, as is common with a number of ancient icons of the Virgin Mary, it is said to be the work of the evangelist St. Luke. That is, of course, apocryphal, but the image is undoubtedly based on a very early prototype. The early history of the icon is rather murky, but most art historians, due to the general form and style of the image, agree that it is probably in origin of the 5th or the 6th century. The Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore was completed in the year 432, directly after and to celebrate the Ecumenical Council of Ephesus that was called to put down the Nestorian heresy on the nature of Christ and declared Mary to be the Theotokos, the God-bearer, the Mother of God. The Basilica was originally dedicated to Mary under the title Mother of God, only gaining the name Santa Maria Maggiore, St. Mary Major, in later centuries, as it was the major or principal church dedicated to the Virgin Mary in Rome. It is quite possible that the icon has been in the church since the 430s, but there is a long-held tradition that the icon was brought from Crete and it had arrived in Rome in the year 590 during the pontificate of Pope Gregory the Great. The image is a classic Byzantine image of the Virgin and Child and was without question painted in the Greek-speaking East. The Greek origin of the image is clearly indicated by the abbreviated Greek inscription on either side of the head of Mary that reads Meta Theou, Mother of God. The size of the icon, it's about 5 foot tall, suggests that it was painted as a processional icon, and icons on this scale are still used in processions in the Eastern Orthodox Church. And it is the use of it for that purpose that probably fixed the icon in the affections of the people of Rome. It is said that during a period of plague in the 590s, that Pope Gregory took the icon in procession through the city for 3 consecutive days to pray for the end of the pestilence. And until the early 17th century, the icon was taken in procession annually in August on the Feast of the Assumption. It has, like many early icons and paintings that we use for devotional and liturgical purposes, been repainted, and probably more than once. In the Middle Ages, the renewal and repainting of an important icon of this type was not considered to inauthenticate it in any way. The top layer of paint we now see, painted so very beautifully, has all the hallmarks of Italian work of the very early 13th century. Before being placed in the Pauline Chapel in the 17th century, the icon was kept in many different locations in the Basilica. Before the 13th century, it was apparently kept over the door to the baptistry, a structure that has now long gone. In the 13th century, it was moved to a new enclosure in the nave, and perhaps that is when it was repainted. At least twice in its history, the icon has been given a canonical coronation by the Pope, a way of honouring the importance of the image. The first was by Pope Gregory XVI on the Feast of the Assumption 1838, and the second during the Marian year 1954 under Pius XII. The images of Mary and Christ were each given gold crowns, and Mary was given a jewelled necklace, which were put onto the image during principal feasts of the year. By 2017, the image was in very poor condition, and it was conserved in the Vatican. The icon was cleaned and consolidated and treated for worm damage, and some of the more recent overpainting was removed from the icon's surface. This image shows the areas of loss to the 13th century paint layer after cleaning. These losses were expertly repaired. Once completed in 2018, the image was considerably brighter, and it has now been replaced in the previous position, but in a new sealed case and in a controlled environment. The icon was returned to the church in January of 2018, with Pope Francis celebrating a pontifical mass in its honour. The image has been of particular significance to the Jesuit order. On Christmas Day of 1538, St Ignatius of Loyola, the order's founder, celebrated his first Mass as a priest in Santa Maria Maggiore. This act cemented the icon's importance as a source of inspiration and protection for the Jesuits. The Jesuits promoted devotion to the Salus Populi Romani as part of their mission to spread Marian piety during the Counter-Reformation. Copies of the icon were distributed to Jesuit missions worldwide, particularly in the Americas and Asia, fostering global veneration for this ancient image. It is Pope Francis's own devotion to the icon of the Salus Populi Romani, a natural devotion given his Jesuit background, that accounts for his burial in this basilica. Since the beginning of his pontificate in 2013, Francis made it a tradition to visit the Salus Populi Romani before embarking on international journeys, and to entrust his travels to the Virgin Mary's protection. He would also routinely give thanks before the icon on his safe return. He would often pray for some time before the icon and lay flowers at the foot of the altar in the Pauline Chapel. And one of the most touching elements of the late Pontiff's funeral was how, on arrival in the church, his coffin was taken to the entrance of the Pauline Chapel as children laid flowers before the icon one last time on his behalf. Pope Francis wished to be buried as close to this icon as possible, and his coffin now lies feet away from it, but in a position that doesn't disturb the important visual and architectural coherence of the basilica as a whole. So what can be said about Pope Francis's tomb? Well, it is really rather simple, as have been the tombs of all recent Roman pontiffs. A burial vault has been created under the steps that lead to the niche, and capping the entrance is a simple but large slab of stone bearing only the name Franciscus. The stone itself, which is not fine polished marble, contrasts with the stone around it and has been sourced from Liguria, which is where the Pope's grandparents came from. A very nice touch has been the inclusion on the back wall of the tomb recess of an enlarged version of the silver pectoral cross that Pope Francis wore both as Pope and as a Cardinal. On it is depicted an image of Christ, the Good Shepherd. And so the burial of Pope Francis adds yet another layer to the ancient and continuous history of this remarkable 1600-year-old basilica.